Let us pray. Guide us, Lord, in all our doings with your gracious favor. Further to your continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and finally by mercy attain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Pray at this time for our nation as we journey through this hurricane season. Father of all elements of nature, obey your command. Calm the storms and hurricanes that may threaten us at this time, and turn our fear of your power into praise of your goodness. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. And together we say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session. Minutes. I receive minutes of a meeting of Wednesday, August the 2nd, 2023, to be deferred. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the minutes of the aforementioned date be deferred.
The question is that the minutes of a meeting held on Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023, be deferred. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. Those minutes are therefore deferred. In terms of further announcements,
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honor.
we have excuses for absence from Senator the Honourable Jerome Walcott, Senator Monique Tate, and Senator Christopher Maynard. An apology for lateness from Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers. There's other announcements. It's my pleasure to welcome a number of visitors to our chamber today. We'll start with the young ones first. We're very, very happy to have perhaps some future members of the Honourable Senate who are currently in their manifestation as Class 2 students of the St. Martin's Mangrove Primary School, along with their teacher, Ms. Michelle Cave. She's been trying, have a seat, youngsters. She's been trying to arrange this tour for, well, logistical issues, sometimes being available on the day that the Senate was not meeting and not being available on the day that the Senate was meeting. But this is part of her program of work, where she was teaching in social studies about Parliament and so on, part of civics, and she indicated that she desperately wanted the opportunity for some of the children to come and have a tour of Parliament to complete that segment on Parliament and so on. So I welcome you, Ms. Gale, and thank you for your service, and I applaud you for having this particular interest and providing the opportunity for these young ones to see one of the institutions which has had and will continue to have a great impact on their lives. So thank you for your service. And welcome, youngsters. I'll mark your faces and inquire about your names. I expect to see one of these names or faces in here or the other place in another 20-something years, perhaps. Students of a different level who are perhaps a lot closer to being in this place or wherever they choose to be. We have students of the UNN Law School who are currently interning with the distinguished firm of Clark, Gittins and Farmer, of whose distinguished managing partner is our own, one of our partners, actually. I'm elevating him even further. He's so distinguished. But he just fits the frame, he just fits the profile. But Senator Kevin Boyce is a partner of the firm, and he is providing some leadership to these wonderful young people. Olius David, Makaja Williams, and Satya Small. Welcome to you all. I wish you success in your legal career, and perhaps your legal career will find you sojourning somewhere in the Parliament. And if you don't want to be on one side or the other, be down the middle like the clerks of Parliament, all attorneys at law, and really serve this in a very substantial way. But the business of government in all its manifestations, not just political government, but the passing of laws, implementation, compliance, technical advice, international treaties, they're all rooted in law at the end of the day. So thank you for coming, and happy to have you. Not exactly visitors, the staff of the various government departments who service Parliament in its meeting and support their ministers and so on. But we do have the Director of National Insurance and Deputy Director. Director and Deputy, we're very, very happy to have you all as folks who they sit on, they're probably based on what they represent. They represent the highest net worth of anyone in here. Based on the portfolio which they manage. We're very happy to have you all today. Those are the end of announcements for today.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate, and moved by Minister.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. That standing order is therefore suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bill, the Pensions Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2023.
The question is that the Pensions Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2023 be read the first time. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 2, in the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the National Insurance and Social Security Amendment Bill 2023.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I rise to seek your permission to treat to items number 2 and 3 as a cognate debate for the purposes of today's sitting.
The question is that the Honourable Senate consider treating order number 2, which is the second reading of the National Insurance and Social Security Amendment Bill 2023, and order number 3, the second reading of the Pensions Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2023 as a cognate debate. And just to remind for clarity and for the purposes of our visitors, even though, if agreed, we will have one debate on our second reading, the bills will be voted for individually as separate order number 2 and order number 3. So the question is that orders number 2 and 3 be treated as a cognate debate. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. Therefore, treat to order number 2 and 3 in this second reading speeches. Senator Cummings. Oh, sorry. Order number, no, he's already called it. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Very often when I rise in this chamber, depending on the issue that we're treating to, I do say things like I want to make a few brief remarks, or it is a simple issue for the consideration of the Senate. But today it is not quite so. Today we are dealing with an issue that has captured national attention and in fact is a debate that has been underway globally for some years. And we are speaking today to measures relating to our national insurance scheme. I want to frame my comments within a broad framework of social security and social security schemes and how they are being reformed globally. Mr. President, today the 2 bills that we're treating to as a cognate debate are the following, and I want to connect them, and I'm perhaps being a little bit more deliberate in my comments today because we have guests who you have already described as persons who we expect in some way, shape, or form to be sitting in this place at a later time. In fact, I have to say that in meeting Ms. Cave from the younger group that is here today, and going to introduce myself to each of the individual students joining us today, I was blown away by how confident and articulate each of them presented to me. Each of them said, my name is so-and-so and so-and-so. I am 9 years old and I'm from this school. And they reached out and they extended their hands in a very firm, not even a soft handshake, a firm handshake. And so I am confident that when I look around this room, not just in the faces of the interns of Senator Kevin Boyce, from Clark Giddens and Farmer, and the future attorneys at law being graduated from the Hugh Wooding Law School, that even in the faces of those younger persons with us today, not just with us today in the Senate as Class 2 students, Mr. President, but they're with us today as Class 2 students on a civics exercise in the middle of their summer holidays. I think that that is absolutely to be commended, both for their teachers and for their parents, and of course for the students. Well done to all of you. We are very honored to have you in our midst today. So on to the business of today's discussion, Mr. President. I just want perhaps to give a slight caveat. As you would recall, we had an adjournment last sitting, a planned adjournment for the purpose of being able to take a comprehensive briefing of the entire Senate on the issues relating to the bills which we are debating today. It was not something that was unplanned. Notice had been given over the weekend before that we were going to meet and adjourn and to take advantage of the presence of all senators in chamber to have the benefit of a presentation, which was an excellent presentation provided by Mr. Rawdon Adams, Deputy Chairman of the NIS, Ms. Kim Tudor, who is the head of the NIS, and we also had joining us on Zoom the actuarial consultant, Mr. Derry Osborne. And we were represented by every senator, whether physically present in the chamber or on Zoom online. That session was slated to begin at 11:30. Hence our adjournment right after the convocation of the Senate, and it did not end until 2 p.m. And it is my hope that the excellent presentations that we had the benefit of from the team at the NIS would have provided even greater clarity to all of the members of the Honourable Senate. In fact, Mr. President, the ministry with responsibility for the NIS, the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, has conducted, as we know, over the course of the last year plus, extensive consultations, town hall meetings with various groups of persons to ensure that there is not just a consultation to receive comments from persons, but also to share the findings of the various consultative reports, the actuarial reviews, and all of the members. And so I would not wish to have a misrepresentation of what we set out to do intentionally on Wednesday to continue to perpetuate itself. The Senate is a place of serious business, and we are fairly deliberate in all that we do, and we plan our business quite carefully. And so I say for the final time, we had a dedicated, planned internal consultation with the Senate, all senators, government and independent senators, slated for 11:30 last Wednesday, and that was the sole reason for our adjournment. So now, having dispensed with that part of my business as leader of government business in the Senate, I want to get directly into the substance of our debate today. Mr. President, we are here today. There are two bills before us. And over the course of today's presentation, you will hear from various members, certainly on this side, about various aspects of this Social Security paradigm that is being built out under the leadership of an esteemed team that has been constituted to take responsibility for ushering us through. The first bill that is before us, Mr. President, is the establishment of a body corporate. We call it a corporate a state-owned enterprise. There has been an extensive discussion in the public space about state-owned reform, SOE reform. This is one of those instances, Mr. President, where a state-owned enterprise now is being created. In 2019, Mr. President, we passed through this chamber a Public Finance Management Act. And in the Public Finance Management Act, in the second schedule appended to that act, outlines what is described as a commercial state-owned enterprise. A commercial state-owned enterprise typically gets no monies from central government. It is self-sustaining, it finances its own operations, and it is independent even though it is a government entity. And it is expected, Mr. President, that this bill before us today would create the newest and perhaps one of the most important commercial state-owned enterprises in the Barbados landscape. So the National Insurance Scheme is being transitioned from what it is presently into a stand-alone corporate commercial state-owned enterprise. And what does that mean? Mr. President, I happen to also be the minister with responsibility for a few agencies that fall under central government. One of those agencies is CAIPO. You, Mr. President, have been a minister with responsibility for that said entity. It is a very difficult thing, and people may not see it, they may not know it until they have had to experience it. It is a very difficult thing, Mr. President, to be a minister or even a permanent secretary, oftentimes responsible for the administration of a given entity or department, and you have trained, competent professionals who have been equipped with the tools, not just academically, or students have come out of law school, and you will discover that in addition to what you learn in the classroom, there is a period of learning on the ground, internal to a given organization, that cannot be taught outside of that space. Learning how to function in a given office with the rudiments of what comes before the office on a given day is a very precise thing. So learning on the job is critical. When you have departments, like a CAIPO, for example, where you have officers who have been trained in dealing with all post-incorporation issues. And they have been equipped and positioned to lead in various areas. And then, for their own sometimes self-advancement, they may have the benefit of being transferred out into a higher post, into another ministry. And you may find that an officer who has spent 7 years, 10 years, being trained in the rudiments of what is being done in, say, a KIPO, is transferred because there's an opportunity in the Ministry of Culture with Minister Monroe Knight. And all of a sudden, KIPO has lost all of the institutional capacity that went along with that officer. They may find themselves transferred into the Ministry of Transport and Works. And all of a sudden, all of the competencies and the skills that have been developed in that officer, both academically and professionally and experientially having learned on the job, they're gone from the department. In this instance, Mr. President, the National Insurance Scheme is equally faced with the same dilemma. You have a highly specialized area like Social Security, highly specialized group of people dealing with workers and employers alike who understand and have been taught on the job and professionally or academically how to treat to the issues of workers' rights, benefits, how to calculate various types of benefits under the various funds managed by the National Insurance Scheme. And then all of a sudden, they're transferred because they're part of central government to Minister Monroe Knight over in culture or to MTW to manage the roads programs. And it leaves a dearth of experience in that institution. What is being created here, Mr. President, is not only about governance, about which we will speak over time. It is not only about independence and freedom from political interference, about which we will speak. It is not only, Mr. President, about ensuring effective management. We will speak about that too, Mr. President. But this is also about ensuring that our institutions are fit for purpose and equipped with professionals that are fit for the given role to which they have been assigned, and that they are not subject to the vagaries of public sector transfers into and out of the system. This is perhaps the most practical way of explaining it. So sometimes, Mr. President, you may have a person who may find another opportunity, and that is the nature of persons and their individual advancement. And many young people, and we'll talk about that during the course of today, I'm sure that one of my colleagues will speak about the types of evolution that we're seeing with young people in particular, the kinds of skills that they're going into and jobs and what that means for our social security system. But Mr. President, we are seeing more and more of our young people opting not to stay in jobs beyond a certain time. I hear a lot of younger people say 5 years, and that's it. They can't see themselves staying in any one place for more than 5 years. And I see some smiles coming back at me, so I know I may have struck a nerve. But my colleague is here saying to me, actually 2 is less than that. So I think even as we have a conversation around Social Security and future generations, we have to also bear in mind that there has been a cultural shift among younger generations, millennials and younger, about what constitutes long-term employment. The notion of staying in a job for 10, 15, 20, 30 years is not a real thing for persons under a certain age. They have a completely different construct. And so they want to be able to have the flexibility of planning for what comes later while still being in a position to explore all of their prospects while they are in the prime of their lives. And that is something that we have to encourage. So in this instance, Mr. President, the creation of the body corporate, now known as the National Insurance and Security, that will be found under the development of this National Insurance and Social Security Act, Mr. President, which will now be the service, will give effect to that. But then there are 3 things in particular that I want to focus on. What would be the function of it? It would manage the National Insurance Scheme as we know it, as devised by, as outlined by the Act, and it will continue to engage in a large cross-section of policy development work, including advising government and other public authorities on matters relating to the Act, responsible for the policy, organization, and administration of the system of national insurance, appointment of the staff, as I was speaking about, developing of policies for the prudent and efficient management of the fund, approving its budget, establishing an internal audit division, and so on. Mr. President, these are all things which are already done commonly in our existing suite of commercial state-owned enterprises. Among the suite of commercial state-owned enterprises, Mr. President, that many of us would know, I know some of our young people, when I was young, we used to want to go up by the airport and watch planes. The Grantley Adams International Airport is a commercial state-owned enterprise. The Bridgetown Port, many of us used to want to go and see the ships coming in, and sometimes in the middle of the tourist season, we're happy to see the big ships that you can see even from Gun Hill coming down. You see the big ships in the port. The Bridgetown Port is a commercial state-owned enterprise. It is run by a board, it finances itself from its own commercial opportunities, and on the basis of its balance sheet, it oftentimes goes to the market and borrows directly as a result of that independent status. That, Mr. President, is what is envisaged with this entity. But they are going to be managing, Mr. President, the National Insurance Scheme. The National Insurance Scheme, as we all know it to be, treats to the provision of Social Security. And that's where I want to situate the framing of my main comments today, Mr. President. We expect to have a number of persons who will be appointed in senior leadership roles, ranging from, Mr. President, investment officer, operations officer, people development officer, and so on. All of those are persons led by a chief executive officer that will be taking responsibility for leadership of the scheme itself and how it is managed. But why do we even have a national insurance scheme, Mr. President? What is it about? We are all such proud Barbadians, oftentimes. And we talk about it, and certainly the spectacle of Corp Over, the entire season, people talked about our culture and who we are and what we represent and what is important to Barbadians. These are all things that are part of Barbados. And sometimes, only sometimes, I pause to think about what life would have been if I had been born anywhere else in the world except my little rock. But the fact is, we are all Barbadians. We were born here, and we have to be proud of what successive governments have called the Barbadian social contract. The Barbadian social contract establishes a balance of social security measures as managed by the custodian of our social security system, the National Insurance Scheme, and a social protection suite of measures, which covers a broad range of things. And perhaps it was not a bad thing that our colleagues are here today as guests in the chamber, because as I prepared for today's debate and talking about what constitutes the Barbados social contract and why a country like ours would be one, establishing a commercial state-owned enterprise to manage our social security programming, and then engaging in a broader reform process around that, I had to spend a few minutes looking at what we offer here in Barbados relative to anywhere else. And the first message that I want to leave here is that, as former Senator Adams said last week in our briefing in this chamber, when you're comparing, you got to compare apples and apples. You can't compare apples and oranges. And oftentimes when we talk about political systems, we talk about the things that are in front of us. But in the US system, they have this. And in the EU, they have that. And in the UK, they have that. But are we comparing apples and apples? And I'm not talking about levels of development. I'm talking about, in this instance, under a social contract, are we comparing the level of benefits that Barbados' social security and our social protection mechanisms provide to us as citizens with apples? How many other countries in the world provide an equivalent level of social protection and social security to its citizens in the same way that Barbados does? And that is where I want to situate some of my comments. If I were to go, Mr. President, to the World Bank data, I spent a few minutes looking at the World Bank data. They use 2020, 2021 data. Barbados has one of the highest rates, not in the Caribbean, not in the Americas, not among developing countries, not among small states, but it has one of the highest rates in the world in terms of expenditure as a percentage of GDP on education. Close to 7% of our annual GDP, Mr. President, is spent on education. This is part of our social contract. This is part of our social contract with our people. We make sure we invest in our people. This is who we are, right? The Caribbean average, I've already said it's about 7% of annual GDP. The Caribbean average of expenditure on education is 6%. The European average, large industrialized advanced economies with millions more people than we have on this rock, is 5.1%, Mr. President. Latin America, excluding the Caribbean, is 4.6%, and if we include the Caribbean, it's 4.2%. In North America, where many people want to go, and I'm sure many of you have gone on holiday or aspire to go on holiday or want to be able to go and see your family and friends who are there, the North American average is 5.6% and declining. And declining. They're spending less on education, whereas Barbados is spending more. The OECD, as Minister of International Business, oftentimes when I speak of the OECD, it is about defensive measures. But in this instance, the most advanced economies of the world, their rate of expenditure on education is 5.3%. We are extremely blessed, and depending on if you believe in luck, to have been born in this little country called Barbados. In healthcare, also part of our social contract, Mr. President, our rate is 7.4 and rising. The Caribbean average rate is only 6.8, Mr. President, and in most advanced economies, it is below 5% of annual GDP. So Barbados, by all independent measures, has an extensive social safety net and social security protections. I remember, Mr. President, I think I've spoken about this before, being a young student, going off to university at the time in Jamaica and not having any concept of what it meant for children as young as some of our visitors here not to be able to afford to go to school. So given the expenditure we are already having in Barbados as a percentage of GDP on education, we also have further social protections. Okay, so we are spending on primary, secondary, and tertiary level education for all Barbadians. And then we turn around if you're unable to pay for uniforms. There are waivers for uniforms, Mr. President. If we are unable, Mr. President, to pay for school fees, petty fees, which is what, $75 a year or something like that, there are waivers for that. If, Mr. President, we then want to get books, because you gotta get books, right? You must get books, certainly at the secondary school level. We have introduced something which is novel in the developing world, which is a textbook loan scheme. So the government buys the textbooks and you rent the textbooks on an annual basis. Our social protection mechanisms are extensive, Mr. President. We have made sure as a policy and as a government that the most vulnerable among us are always protected at all times, Mr. President. And that is important only because I want to bring us to the point where we get to the other end of the spectrum, Mr. President, where by the time we start to have a conversation around pensions and our elderly, we have equally to ensure that the most vulnerable among us are provided for. And that is where we now start to interrogate what is contained within our social security mechanism. So social protections on the one hand and social security on the other. I found an interesting report, Mr. President, and it said this. It was the report is called the Social Protection Expenditure Review for Barbados. It was done by the International Labour Organization. And I want to read it for the benefit of the colleagues. It says this: Barbados has a long historical tradition of extended social protection programs. The ILO indicates that social insurance is relatively well developed in Barbados. Social insurance, Social Security, NIS, relatively well developed in Barbados, covering all social security branches and having a coverage rate of over 90% of the labor force. Universal health care, I've just spoken about what we're spending on health care, is available for all residents through public provision. What does that mean? I can go into primary, secondary, and tertiary care at the cost of the state. Cost of the state, Mr. President. Social assistance and labor market schemes are also well developed in terms of the number of existing programs. In total, according to the Core Diagnostic Instrument exercise, the country has 41 programs, out of which non-contributory social assistance programs account for 16, while there are 9 non-contributory social care programs, 12 contributory programs, and 4 labor market programs. Despite the positive performance in terms of total initiatives and coverage of the population, the sector faces important challenges in a number of areas. It says this: the national insurance scheme is, for instance, experiencing initial financial pressures coming from increasing expenditures and stable revenues that place pressure, that put the issue of the sustainability of the model for the next 50 years on the table. The report goes on to say the large number of schemes that integrate social assistance complicates the overall administration of the sector, with potential problems in terms of coverage and efficiency, among other complications. The sector is therefore, and I'm quoting, at a critical moment to introduce reforms to enhance the cost effectiveness of the existing levels of spending. This is an ILO social sector report which was prepared on Barbados in, I'm trying to find the year so that you know, this is June 2022. The broad thematic area of work under the ILO is ILO Decent Work Team and Office for the Caribbean. This is a 2022 June report by the ILO. So we know we're spending a lot on social protections. We know that the social protections, because they're so expansive, they then are having a deleterious impact on expenditure as a consequence of the extensive nature of our social assistance programs. And in turn, it places pressure on the national insurance scheme. Now, Mr. President, these are some of the things that I wanted to begin the framing on, for the simple reason, Mr. President, that it is important when we start to speak about why can't the government do this? Why can't the government do that? Why isn't the government paying for this? Mr. President, I want to put it to this honorable chamber today that the level of expenditure that the ILO themselves in its June 2022 has said on social assistance programs in Barbados, based on the independent assessment also of the World Bank in comparing how Barbados is spending on social protections, is in excess of most countries in the world. So it is impossible, therefore, for us to begin to compare Barbados with many other countries in the world, because we're not comparing apples with apples. We may be comparing apples with peaches or apples with pears. Because if in the United States, and I wanted to use countries that people aspire to a lot of times. If in the United States, Mr. President, the United States, I went back to the 1990s when their debate on NIS, on their Social Security reforms took place. In the 1990s, the debate was raging. The looming pressure that was expected to be placed ahead as a result of the baby boomers and that generation entering into retirement, and what that was going to mean for their Social Security protection system. It was found, I found a Brookings Institute report at the time that talked about the U.S. increase in its aging population, which was going to push up the burden of paying for Social Security. This is the U.S. And what was their Social Security? What constituted their Social Security? They had Social Security, yes. Then they had Medicare, they had Medicaid, and then there are a couple of other programs, Mr. President. Nearly all, this is a direct quote again from the Brookings Institution report, Mr. President, this is in the 1990s. Nearly all of the reform proposals at the time involved scaling back the provision of public assistance programs and public retirement benefits. I want to repeat that. Nearly all, not some and not others. Barbados in 2023 is not scaling back on education. In fact, we are increasing our expenditure on education. Barbados is not scaling back on healthcare. In fact, we are increasing our expenditure on healthcare. Barbados is not scaling back on any of the social protection measures that we have historically maintained and been proud of, because this is who we are. Barbados has not scaled back. Even in the conversation now on the Social Security reform and the measures which we will talk about during the course of today that are proposed in the Revitalization NIS report, Barbados has not proposed a scaling back of retirement benefits either. But yet in the 1990s, late 1990s, the great United States of America had all of their proposals around a scaling back. And they were taking advantage not of what they had found only domestically in their own market, Mr. President, but they were climbing the learning curve that had already been climbed by countries like Germany and Japan. Some of the largest economies in the world were scaling back on their social protections for people. Little Barbados, with far fewer people, with far less income in GDP and per capita. Little Barbados, post-COVID, where $600 million came out of the bottom of our economy, where we increased social spending instead of reduced it. A little country like Barbados, even at this point in 2023, having begun this process over a year plus ago, is still not making any commitments at all to scale back benefits or social protections, because we have a social contract with our people. And that is what I'm talking about. We have a social contract with our people. But part of who we are, Mr. President, part of who we are requires us to interrogate that social contract, not for the purpose of scaling it back, but for the purpose, Mr. President, of rationalizing how we as citizens have framed our own expectations on the delivery of that social contract and the implementation of that social contract. Mr. President, in the same Brookings report that I went back to in the 1990s, it said something interesting, and I captured it because I wanted to share it here. Because sometimes, you know, like, I have a daughter, and my daughter is 24 years old, and I'm convinced that she thinks that everything began with this generation. It began and ended with this generation, so fashion is new for them. Oh, mommy, you don't understand what we go through, you know. Yeah, because I wasn't young, I born big. So they all think that it's all new. But even in development policy, oftentimes countries travel the same road at different points in history. And it's always important for us to go back. The conversation that we are having in Barbados today that has been triggered by a discussion on NIS, not just the creation of the corporate body that is before us, but the broader reform agenda, has resulted in a couple of conversations. 1997, this was written, not in 2023 Barbados. It said, countries face a choice among three broad alternatives in reforming their public retirement systems: increasing taxes to pay for a larger retired population, curtailing benefits to keep retirement programs affordable, or moving away from pay-as-you-go financing schemes towards advanced funding of future retirement obligations. This is 1997, Mr. President. This is not speaking about Barbados in 2023. This is 1997 in the United States. It went on to say, the debate over the comparative merits of increasing taxes or cutting benefits is inherently divisive, because it forces generations and income classes into conflict over which group will have to make the larger sacrifice in order to maintain the solvency of the retirement system. Mr. President, this is a Brookings Institution report of 1997 speaking of the United States, but it is equally applicable today to 2023 Barbados on the NIS. A question of reforming the NIS, even without any proposal on scaling back benefits or increasing taxes, is inherently divisive. It causes people to go into conflict between the generations and income classes. But them got more, Mr. President, so them should pay more. Them ain't paying enough, Mr. President, but they're drawing down, so them should be able to carry the burden, Mr. President. Why am I carrying the burden for them, Mr. President? But we should increase the taxes on the employers, Mr. President. The employers should pay more, but who the employers paying more from? Because it is all one Barbados. It is still all one Barbados. And when you say the government should, let us be clear what constitutes the government. The government don't own a business, not one. The government does not trade, don't sell a thing. The government provides services to its people, and if you are a Barbados, you have a social contract that causes you to spend on social assistance and social protection programs that is over and above what you are earning. So when you say the government should do this, let us be clear, because we also have a hate-hate relationship with taxes. So the government's revenue comes from taxes, either from me and you as working class people, or it comes from taxes from businesses owned by you, or alternately run by you, or you work for the businesses. So one way or the other, you are attempting to dip into the same pot a couple of times by saying the government should. And if you consider the social protection platform that I have laid the context for my statements on, Mr. President, you have to consider that the government should has an implication for your social contract. And since the government has made a series of decisions on that social contract, certainly this administration has made it absolutely clear that there will be no scaling back of our social contract with our people, that we are committed to putting people first. This government is perhaps above all else a labor government. We put workers first. We put workers at the center of our discussion. And so, Mr. President, there can be no scaling back of benefits, but there has to be, at the same time, the balance of rights, which we are guaranteeing, and responsibilities. There was a Calypso song that I know that if my colleague, Senator Rogers, was not at his Wednesday morning service, he would probably be able to give me the words to, and I'm probably going to be inaccurate in saying it, but you can't get, well, you want something for nothing? She can't, what? Something along the lines of something for nothing. You can't get all for nothing. You can't get all for nothing. You can't get all for nothing, Mr. President. And that's a hate relationship that we have with taxes. We don't want to pay more taxes, but we still want to be able to maintain the same level of benefits. Mr. President, I was one, and most of us in here would have been one of the people who, when there was a scaling back in support for young budding professionals like those who are joining us today from Hugh Wooding, from paying University of the West Indies fees, then, Mr. President, we would have been one of the ones that said, but you can't do that. That's the future, that's young people, that's a social contract. I saw today in the newspaper that there is an increase in fees, tuition fees for UWI students. Again, Mr. President, we were lucky and blessed, depending on what you believe in, because I remember being a young student too at the Mona campus and seeing notices just like that, increases in university tuition fees, Mr. President. But you know what? I had the comfort of knowing that don't affect me because my government is paying my tuition. Tuition fees paid for by the government of Barbados. But as a young university student, see me outside in my supposed battle gear and fatigues, facing down policemen with heavy artillery in Jamaica on the streets of Kingston, joining my CARICOM colleagues in protest at the increase in tuition fees to UE. Because while it did not affect me personally, it affected them because their governments did not pay their tuition in the same way mine did. So they were, in some cases, facing the choice of where they're going to find this extra money, or in some cases, drop out because they can't afford it. Barbadians haven't had to make those kinds of difficult choices, certainly for the most part of our post-independence life. We haven't had to make those choices. But what I'm toying with in my mind, and I've thought about it in a number of different incarnations, I wonder what it would be, Mr. President, if we showed Barbadians what it really costs to maintain the services that we take for granted. Because unless I'm standing in a queue at places like healthcare institutions or education institutions or various social protection programs and having to fork money out of my purse or ask somebody to help, I don't really register that there is still a cost, even if not a direct cost to me. It is an indirect cost because the government has paid for it. So if I were to go and get surgery at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, I may be vexed that I gotta wait long, or I may be vexed it gets rescheduled, but I don't pull my pocket really for anything. It's paid for by somebody, and that somebody is the government of Barbados by taxes. The taxes we don't want to get increased. And equally so, Mr. President, here it is that in 2023, we are forced into a discussion around making critical decisions to ensure that we are able to protect our social security system. We have before us a suite of the governance mechanisms that are being proposed in the order establishing the body corporate, and we will go through some of those. I want to specifically focus, Mr. President, for a moment on the investment committee, because the investment committee is critical. The investment committee then becomes the custodian of the investment policy. And the investment policy then creates that balance, Mr. President, between how the gap between contributions and expenditure of the NIS will then be closed by an effective investment policy of the NIS. Mr. President, my mother and I were having this conversation earlier up in the week. Well, maybe not earlier up in the week. It had to be late last week, because earlier up in the week I was on the road. But last week, somewhere around there, we were having this conversation. And she was saying to me, in trying to rationalize it, because she's already retired, and she was saying to me, but Lisa, when I put my money in the bank, I don't know what the bank is doing with it. And I was reminding her of a friend of mine who years ago used to work in one of the investment sections of one of the local commercial banks. And my friend would say, oh, I only have 500 million to invest today. That's not a lot. And the monies that we deposit into the commercial banks, they use in investments. But you get back less than 1% in interest on your money in the bank, though. I said to her, she said to me, but when I put my money in the bank, I don't ask the bank whether it's invested. I be quarreling about is the line long, and if I got to pay fees at the teller, or if I got to pay fees at the ATM for charging at a different ATM. Those are the things I think about, but I don't think about where the money is being invested to make money for the bank while giving me less than 1%. And she said to me, so in the same way with the NIS, why am I even having a conversation around what the NIS does to invest in the fund? Because in this instance, they're not using the investment for their own benefit. They're using it to pump back into the social security system. That was her very casual way of looking at it. Perhaps not the most accurate, but it was her very casual way of looking at it. I thought she was onto something. We have to be concerned about the investment committee's work. We do have to be concerned about the investment policy and what the framing of the NIS system is. We do have to be concerned about those things. And it is for those reasons that there is a comprehensive governance reform that is captured in this bill. In the investment committee, how it is meant to function, how it reports into the system, how it is composed, how we're supposed to deal with things like vesting of assets, and so on. And now I have made a complete muddle of the words of a calypso that I wanted to get right. Senator Rogers has now joined us when I needed his help earlier on calypso, calypso words. So, Mr. President, there are a number of reform measures that are proposed. That is not what we are debating today. We're not talking about the changes in the retirement age as proposed in the ministerial statement. Those things are not in the bill. However, the ministerial statement has taken the opportunity to go into those proposed details that this entity, the National Insurance Service, will be charged with responsibility for shepherding through the system. So, Mr. President, in summary, I just, however, do want to list what those measures are as proposed by the Honourable Minister in the other place, and I will, my colleagues will go into the details a little bit more in the course of their own presentations. One, Mr. President, despite what countries like the United States proposed back in 1997, and then in 2020, and then in 2022, is scaling back of all benefits. The first and perhaps most important finding of the revitalization report is that there is to be no increase in the contribution rate for employers or employees. That's the first thing. Barbados has not gone in the direction of increasing the contributions. We could not have done so. Secondly, Mr. President, there is a 1-year increase proposed in the pensionable age in 2 steps. The 1-step process will be moving it from 67, as it is presently, to 67.5 years in 2028. So not tomorrow, not next year, but in 2028, and 68 in 2034. So there is adequate time to plan, and we will talk a little bit about what that opportunity will present during the course of the rest of today's sitting. There is a change also in the qualification time period for a reduced pension in 3 steps. 61 by 2025, 62 by 2028, and 63 by 2031. There were also changes in the pension formulae for future old age contributory pensions, which allows for changes to be made with that regard in terms of people qualifying for full pension after 40 years. And so that is one of the changes. And then there's an increase in the number of contributions required and so on. Then, Mr. President, you will recall that after the estimates of expenditure last year, we did come back with a number of amendments to legislation, including the cost of living resolutions to give effect to the salary increases, the 5% salary increases. There was also among those measures, Mr. President, a cost of living adjustment for pensioners. We did that earlier in the year as part of the estimates, and that is also inbuilt. A cost of living adjustment is inbuilt into the new recommendations, and I've already spoken about the national insurance transitioning and the investment policy and financing policy. Then we have two final elements here, Mr. President, not, again, as I said, being debated here, but a change to the wages used to calculate pensions from the best 5 years to the best 10 years, and then finally to increase the early reduction and late adjustment factors from 6 to 9% per annum. Mr. President, those are the primary elements contained within the reform proposals that this board, which is being created, will cover. The second bill, Mr. President, speaks to a contributory pension for certain categories of public officers. You have identified which categories they are. They include persons who are teachers, for example, public service, public employees, and so on. Teachers in secondary schools, Pensions Act would have some changes there. Statutory boards, Pensions Act. And so that is the second piece of legislation that we are amending here today. Mr. President, I just want, in my final comments on this point, to end somewhat where I started. We have an amazing country that has developed a historical and maintained a contemporary social contract with its people. Even in the most difficult of times, we have maintained that social contract, Mr. President. We have heard from the Honourable Prime Minister about the work of the Population Commission, and we've heard about the findings of the various reporting of, at different points in time. I believe ECLAC, I also found an interesting report of ECLAC, which gave us the population pyramid. We are, for the first time, Mr. President, having a declining population. Barbados is not what it used to be. I mean, we cannot, you know how you used to go by your grandmother. I used to enjoy going by, older family members and sitting down and hearing the stories of the good old days and what it was like when they used to be, when they were young and when they were growing up. Mr. President, development policy is not static. And while sometimes different scenarios may present themselves in different ways at different times, time always must make a difference. What a country could have done 20 years ago, they cannot necessarily do now. What a country could have done in response to a given measure 10 years ago, maybe circumscribed by entirely different circumstances. No, Mr. President, because time, everything has to be divided by time. And so right now, Mr. President, Barbados's unique dynamics at this stage of the National Insurance Scheme, they are completely different to when the NIS was established in 1967. We now have an aging population. Our demographics are changing. We have fewer young people entering the formal workforce. We've spoken about that already. And when you enter the formal workforce, you're not necessarily spending a long time in that formal workforce. You want to be able to do your own thing. The demographics of how people approach work, the future of work, which is also the subject of an ILO report, is so different now. And so we now have a national insurance fund whose expenditure has outstripped its contributions. What we are taking into the National Insurance Fund is less than we are spending. Imagine if it is in your personal budget, Mr. President, and I want to take the opportunity just to break it down for our younger members who are visiting with us today. If your parent, mommy or daddy, gives you $5 to take to school, and that's supposed to last you for the day to buy some lunch, and I'm using a conservative number deliberately, but I know that some young people may get $20 or $50, even more on a daily basis. But if mommy gives you $5 a day, and you go to school and you spend $12, You can't spend $12 because you only have 5 unless you borrow it from somebody. So there has to be a conversation that Barbados has equally with the NIS, which is what we're doing now, about how much we spend in order to supply that, to meet the needs of that social contract that we have committed on to people, and how much we take in. How much are the contributions, which we're not increasing? We don't want to increase taxes, so we got to pay for it somewhere. And we have to have a logical conversation about it, so not an emotive. I feel, but I would like, I still want, is that logical? Is it realistic to expect it, given what we have already outlined is our social compact? Is it logical? Is it realistic? Based on what we already know is our expenditure as a country relative to countries that earn far more than we do. Is it logical? Is it reasonable, Mr. President, for us to be able then to say, what are we proposing to take money away from? Are we proposing we're going to defund education? Are we proposing to defund something else that is equally important to Barbadians at all stages of our development? So we have to make some difficult decisions. And one thing I am clear on is that a government that came to office in 2018, Mr. President, facing terrible financial and fiscal circumstances in a country and made difficult decisions immediately and taught the country through it. A government, Mr. President, that faced a pandemic, the first since the 1930s, and made difficult decisions and taught the country through it. A government, Mr. President, that had the first hurricane since the 1960s and made difficult decisions and taught the country through it. And now is in a position, Mr. President, where you are in recovery mode with a 3.5% growth rate, despite all of those things, Mr. President. A government who has to make decisions on the reform of the national insurance scheme is going to make difficult decisions in the interest of our country and with full regard for our social compact with our people, and we will talk the country through it. That has been our way, Mr. President, from the day we took office. And as long as we are in service to our people and the custodians of the social contract that we have maintained for all of our time with our people, Mr. President, the national insurance scheme, these bills before us, the reform measures that are ahead of us, Mr. President, that will come over the course of time, they will be in the interest of all Barbadians, and in particular, with a view to protecting the most vulnerable among us, because that is the nature of our social security system, but it is who we are, Mr. President. And with these few words, I'm obliged to you, and I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator, sorry? Mr. Dr. Shongrel, Senator Dr. Murray Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I welcome our guests here with us this morning, I think that perhaps if one believed in coincidence, that we would say that it is a good coincidence that they are here with us this morning as we debate these amendments having to do with our national insurance and social security. Because essentially what we are debating and talking about is really a generational contract. It is really about the extent to which we have a national security system that provides not only for us, but more importantly, for the future generation. It is a debate that calls for a level of courage and governance, and it is a debate that is also at the same time national, because it embraces and impacts all of us. And I say that deliberately, Mr. President, because there's often a view that when we are in this place and in the other place, as policymakers and as politicians, that somehow we are divorced from the decisions that we make, that we are making policy for other people, that somehow doesn't touch us, and impact on us. And I look at these young people in here and I see a reflection of my daughter, cousins, grandchildren. No, but I'm saying I can see that reflection for all of us here. And that is important, that, Mr. President, that we appreciate that the policies and the decisions that we make here, although difficult, and that is the weight that we carry as part of the governance framework to make difficult decisions, that those ramifications touch us, so that in the context of decision making, we are not doing so thoughtlessly, we're not doing so because we just have a bright idea, but because fundamentally we have a charge and a responsibility, not only, as I said before, Mr. President, for ourselves, but to honor that generational contract to ensure the future. And therefore, Mr. President, I appreciate the sensitivity with which this issue is to be treated. I appreciate the level of concern and angst in the context of the debate that is going on within the society. Because fundamentally, Mr. President, our social security system is part of the very bedrock of our social democratic system. It is part of the legacy of post-colonial societies that very much still carry the scars of that heritage. A society that still bears some of the scars of exploitation of workers and disenfranchisement. And in some instances, Mr. President, that level of disenfranchisement exploitation still happens today. We are a society that is still contending with building equity and addressing persistent generational poverty. So that our social security system stands within that context, it stands within that background, and was intended to stand as a buffer also against that legacy and against that history. It is for this reason that when we talk about our social security system, it becomes sensitive because it is very much tied to every single navel string in this country, because it means that much to us. And if we say, Mr. President, that the peg of the Barbados dollar against the US is the holy grail, then our social security system is even higher, is even more fundamental to all of us. And therefore, we are all impacted, Mr. President, by this debate and by this discussion. Mr. President, the National Insurance Scheme was developed in 1967, but it was built on a framework in which this country had some level of history in terms of providing relief. We started in the 1800s with the Poor Law Relief Act, and we've seen an expansion of the National Insurance Framework, Mr. President. In 1967, though, I want to be able to contextualize where we are. We were on the cusp of the first anniversary of independence. We also had a country in which the population was growing. If you look at the statistics at that time, we had 5,537 births and 2,045 deaths. When we look at the population statistics at that time, some more. In 1960, the population was 232,000. In 1970, it was 237,000. In 1975, it was 255,000, and it stayed around that average throughout the 1980s into the 1990s. In 1993, we were at 264,000. We had a population that was growing. And that population that was growing also led to buoyancy in the context of the economy as well. A productive population at work fuels, in good circumstances, a buoyant economy. Life expectancy at that time, Mr. President, due to living conditions, was 68, and the pensionable age was then set at 60, so that there was an 8-year gap. So I got my pension at 60 with the expectation, roughly, that I would live about 8 years, so that people were drawing down from a pension scheme within the context of hoping then to be able to enjoy that life for roughly about an 8-year period. Mr. President, if we look at the actual NIS statistics for that same period when we started, and that in the context of looking at the contributions versus the expenditure. In 1969, the contribution income was 5.8 million. The total expenditure, however, was 0.8 million. And Mr. President, I won't go through all of them, but I have from 1969 right down to 1995. In 1993, the contribution income was 63.6 million, and the expenditure was 85.4. The demographics begin to change. So we come through a period of between 1969 right down to about 1991 or so, where you have contributions exceeding expenditure, and then we begin to see a slow shift in the other direction. And then we go then down to 1994, where the contribution expenditure was 169.2 million, and the total expenditure 170.4 million. To say all of that, Mr. President, is that the national insurance scheme
So just for
doesn't
clarity,
operate.
I think the main contribution income was
Income,
63.
sorry.
And yes, so I just want to repeat for the record.
Yes, let me make that last point again, Mr. President. So I think I was saying that, and I quoted the figures from the contribution income from 1994 at 169.2 million, and the total expenditure of 170.4, so that in that context, expenditure then began to exceed the contribution income. And I was suggesting that it was important to note that, because what it says to us that the national insurance scheme responds to prevailing conditions. It doesn't exist outside of society, but it responds to how well we are doing, or importantly, Mr. President, how well we are actually growing. Mr. President, I liken the operations of the NIS a bit, somewhat to a susu. And I don't know if the young people here know what a susu is, or I've heard the word the susu. Meet and turn. Or the meet and turn may be closer to what that generation may understand. It's a traditional way of savings, right? So we pool all of our money together in order to get some benefit, not immediately, but later down. So if all of us in here put our money together, and then we decide who will get what over a period of time. So I may begin to make contributions to my meet and turn in January, but I will not see my money until December. Yeah? So that money is pooled, but the benefit, one, doesn't just accrue to me, but to everybody else who is part of that meet and turn over time. And that is an important principle, Mr. President. It's an important principle in the context of how our NIS regime functions. It functions well if members are actually paying in their money into the meet and turn, meeting their commitments, paying in at the same time, so that we all can benefit in the long run. If people don't pay in, then we run into trouble, we run into crisis. And the amount that we receive is also dependent on the number of persons who pay in and who join the meet and turn or the susu. And similarly, in the context of our national insurance scheme, we need to have a sufficient base in the meet and turn in order for it to function effectively and to make sure that it will continue to deliver the benefits for those who are part of the arrangement, Mr. President. We have had a number of changes to the National Insurance Scheme since 1967. We've seen a number of changes that broadened the base, that broadened the slew and the suites of benefits that could occur in the context of the insurance scheme. But we've also seen, Mr. President, measures that have been about ensuring that the scheme remains, and the fund remains sustainable. Mr. President, the former Prime Minister, Honourable Orenatha, God continue to rest his soul, in the presentation of his financial and economic policies in 2002, commented at the time that the fund was at its soundest footing in 35 years. This is 2002. At that time, the investment portfolio was growing. He quoted and he noted it as being at 1.5 billion. But even as the country was facing an economic contraction after a long period of growth, the then Prime Minister, and I quote, "However, this mandate handed to the managers of the Social Security system the world over does not merely concern itself with current financial viability, but also is framed to look considerably into the future and to ensure similar security and viability for the current working population and the nation's children." The fund was not in trouble. The fund was not in crisis. But then Prime Minister Orenatha in 2002 was saying to us that we needed to look beyond the current. And he was speaking to the generational contract, that responsibility that we had to ensure the future for the coming generations. Mr. President, at that time, the 10th actuarial report on the function of the scheme showed that there would be depletion of the scheme in 2032. The former Prime Minister, who was, as we all know, an esteemed economist, went on to say, "I must stress at this point, that this eventuality is driven only, Mr. President, to a limited extent by economic and financial influences," and I make the point, again, that at that time, the economy, as was indicated, was going through a contraction after a long period of growth. The then Prime Minister said, "It is driven only to a limited extent by economic and financial influences, but is almost exclusively due to the current demographic metamorphosis our nation is undergoing." The then Prime Minister continued, "Because of the absolutely vital role our national insurance scheme plays in the lives of practically every one of our nation's citizens, this transformation requires considered, early, and radical action." That was in 2002. For a fund that the 10th actuarial report said will be depleted in 2032, the then Prime Minister was saying to us, we needed to act. And act, the then Prime Minister did, because he announced in that same speech a slew of measures that framed our current national insurance scheme. So, Mr. President, we are here 21 years later facing a similar moment, but perhaps within a different context, because of a hope that I've shared is that the function and well-being of the scheme responds to particular contexts, so that there are those that would suggest to us that the then Prime Minister fixed everything in 2002, and therefore there is nothing that should be done, it shouldn't be tinkered with because a fix was applied. Mr. President, I would agree, because in 2002, we did see a rebound of the National Insurance Scheme going on when the measures started to be implemented from 2006. But it was within a particular context. At that time, the then Prime Minister could not have seen the level of demographic deficit that we are having now. He could not have seen the impact of COVID-19. He was not that good, Mr. President. He was good, but he was not that good. So that the pronouncements and the fix that was applied in 2002, it cannot be suggested within this context, 21 years later, different circumstances, Mr. President, that we should not now adjust to the context that we have. In fact, Mr. President, the record would show that the 15th actuarial report identified at that time that there was an emerging problem that needed to be addressed, Mr. President. That 15th actuarial report noted that the fund, Mr. President, was in jeopardy. It indicated that the number of NIS contributions declined sharply to its lowest since 1998, while payouts for all benefits increased. And it said, Mr. President, that the National Insurance Fund expenditure outstripped contributions in 2014 for the first time since 1997, Mr. President, since 1997. If I go on to say, Mr. President, that report further said that at that time the administration was acting against the advice of the actuary, then I would be accused of making a partisan comment. I'm not making a partisan comment, I'm quoting fact. The actuary is not an appointee of government. The actuary is an independent arbiter, producing an independent report. It is fact. It is available on the National Insurance website, Mr. President, for all to see. I can quote you page and paragraph. It is there and as a matter of fundamental record, Mr. President. So again, to suggest again that a fix was applied and nothing to be done, when in fact we have in the context of the actuarial report pinpoints that say to us something was going wrong. The failure of the administration, Mr. President, in 2014 to act on what was indicated in that report is also a matter of public record. But this government, Mr. President, this government that we serve on this side, that is not who we are. That is not who this administration is. The 17th actuarial report has identified again a problem, has said to us that in the context of where we are now, that between 2034 and 2041, we face a depletion of the fund and therefore urgent reform measures are needed. It would be irresponsible of this government to ignore what has been put before us, to ignore the generational contract and responsibility, Mr. President, we have. That is not good governance, Mr. President. It is not good governance. The mettle of this administration is not one to run away from difficult situations and difficult dialogues, Mr. President. That is why we are engaging in educational reform. That is why we are bringing comprehensive child justice and child protection legislation. That is why we are bringing back integrity legislation, Mr. President. Because courage, and the courage to govern in the face of difficulty, is the mettle of this administration. And it is the mettle that we will carry in the context of this debate and the reform measures that are needed to make sure that the NIS maintains sustainability. Mr. President, I want to also say, as the leader of government business indicated, that this is not a new problem or challenge. This is not one that applies only to Barbados. This is a phenomenon that is facing countries globally. The leader of government business quoted a number of reports that she referred to as well, Mr. President. As early as 2011, and I'm sure there are earlier ones, the IMF had a paper which showed, or rather discussed, that the issue of pension reform will become one of the most pressing challenges for advanced and emerging economies, and noted that pension reform can help to prevent a worsening of generational inequity, and also as well serve to provide greater policy space for public investment. In 2020, there's also a paper coming out of the European Union that examined pension schemes across the European Union and notes, importantly, Mr. President, that the demographic factors and economic conditions are raising concerns about the sustainability of pension schemes. And the report went on to say a number of things, but importantly as well, it raised the point that the demographic challenge would eventually come to the point where over the long term, the gap between income, which households expect to receive at retirement, and the income which pension schemes are effectively able to pay will become even more significant. It is a challenge, Mr. President, that the globe is facing, that the region is facing as well. Mr. President, so much so that countries in Europe with the same dilemma have started to look at different ways of how to tackle this issue, with some of them looking to formally tie life expectancy to the age of retirement. So that the Netherlands, for instance, are projecting a retirement age of 70 by 2040. But at the same time, I also want to note that where we think that the retirement age is static, it can be adjusted as well depending again on the particular context. So we have examples of, for instance, where 70 was the retirement age in Ireland until the early 1980s and in Norway until the early 1970s. It came down in both, and once again, it is projected to rise once more. And in both of those instances, Mr. President, demography is the driver. Population is the driver. And it is important to know that, Mr. President, because we will consider, and we have been asked to consider, whether or not we can look at other things, whether or not there are other reasons for the depletion of the fund at this point. And there are a number of factors and a number of things that we can do. But the fundamental driver, there are a number of determinants. We can look at factors, but then we have to identify what is the main determining factor. What is the one that will have the most impact on all of the others? And that factor, Mr. President, is population dynamics. Barbados' social security system is relatively more mature than others, not only in the region, but internationally as well. It is not only more mature, Mr. President, it is more expansive. We provide sickness benefit, maternity, unemployment, old age, invalidity, funeral benefit, including, Mr. President, a non-contributing pension paid out of the consolidated fund. Additionally, our system is one of the most generous regionally and comparatively internationally as well. So while it is true that we have the highest contribution rate at 18.3% when you look at regional comparisons, we also have the region's highest minimum pension. Highest minimum pension at $1,053. And I'll use US dollars only for the sake of comparison. So that's about US $526. The second highest minimum pension in the region, Mr. President, is Trinidad at $450 US. And the third highest, Mr. President, is Bahamas at US $346, Mr. President. The most expansive and the most generous. And that's in the region. But globally as well, Mr. President, we stand positively in the context of comparison. So if you look, for instance, at Saudi Arabia, which have a higher fertility rate as well as positive population dynamics, they provide, Mr. President, USD $526 as their minimum pension against ours at the same small island state, lower population, lower GDP, and we are providing a pension on par, Mr. President. We do it within 15 years only, and there are only 6 other countries that provide as generous a pension scheme as ours. We are, Mr. President, more generous than Spain. While many schemes are running now to 20 years, again, we are at 15. France, the second most productive economy. In their system, you have to work 43 years, as opposed to 40 years, even though they have capped their eligibility age at 64. In Barbados, 35 years of work will allow you to achieve the maximum. Mr. President, I note that my time is slowly drawing to an end. But I want to say as well that if you look at regional comparisons, Trinidad and Tobago's last actuarial review projected the depletion of its fund in 2035. Trinidad and Tobago raised its contribution rate 8 times raised its contribution rate 8 times since 2000 in 23 years. And a paper from the Central Bank considering options for reform spoke to increasing the qualifying period from 750 weeks to 1,001 in Trinidad and Tobago, the region's second oldest population after Barbados. Mr. President, there are those that would suggest that we can't compare because our cost of living is higher. But we also as well have made provision for that. The calculation for our minimum pension is also as well tied, Mr. President, to our wages and price index and ensuring that we allow people to remain above the poverty line. Based on the last study on the living conditions in Barbados, that poverty line was set at $642.53 per month. Our minimum pension, Mr. President, is $1,053, way above the minimum pension, Mr. President. And again, if we look at one of the amendments before us, we would see again that we have, as the leader of government has spoken to, the cost of living increase in contributing pension, a provision made for adjustments to be made based on the rate of inflation as directed. Mr. President, as I close, I want to again come back to perhaps where I started, and that notion of that generational contract, that notion of what good governance is about, that notion of the fact that we must face the challenges that we have before us head on, not because they're going to be comfortable, Mr. President. Governance is not always about being comfortable. I want to say as well that in the context of this discussion and the reform measures, that the government sought, as was indicated, to consult heavily, and there are those, Mr. President, and I must say, one of the things about being involved, sometimes at this level, is the high level of dishonesty with which people will speak just for political expediency and to make a point, Mr. President. You are invited to a meeting where you can be part of the decision-making process, where you can hear the recommendations. You don't turn up, but then get and shout all over the place that you don't know nothing about what's going on after you have received an invitation and were initially consulted, and there are minutes, Mr. President, to prove that you were initially consulted in that discussion. It is a dishonest discussion, Mr. President. I have the dates here. The dates here.
But of course, just for clarity, you're not referring to any member of any of the honourable
Absolutely not. I have
Senate or the House.
Absolutely
by definition.
not. Absolutely not. I don't think I have said anything that would suggest that I am speaking to any member of the House, Mr. President. I have the dates here of all the consultations and who were met with, Mr. President. From the faith-based organizations to the Democratic Labour Party to the APP to the BW Executive Council to the UPW BART, Caswell Franklin on August 4th, media managers, town hall meetings, dates here, Mr. President, and like I said, minutes for every meeting that was had. You can go on the NIS website as well, and you're able then to even download all the town hall meetings. Mr. President, I close on this point as well, because fundamentally, again, we have to address the dishonest conversation. We had these consultations, yes, to inform people of the actual report. But then we then put together a core group, a representative core group, Mr. President, a representative and an expert core group, Mr. President. Rod Adams, Wismar Graves, a former deputy chairman of the NIS, Sir Roy Trotman, Marcia Cattle, a former Minister of Economic Affairs, but an economist in her own right, Professor Justin Robertson, who was the former chair of the NIS under a former administration, being pardoned, Mr. President. Senator Crystal Drakes, an independent senator and a respected economist in her own right, and the actuary, Derek Osborne. And that didn't stop there. There was a working committee. There was an advisory committee as well, Mr. President, also representative and made up of all of the sectors, again, Mr. President, that were important. And it was those consultations, those meetings, those dialogues that have led us here, Mr. President, to this point. We have been faithful to the public trust of consultation and of dialogue. We have been faithful, Mr. President. Mr. President, I see you're looking again at the clock. So that tells me again, Mr. President, that I am in danger of running over my time. And he's telling me to wrap up now. Mr. President, I am passionate about this debate. I'm always passionate about everything that we debate in this House because, again, the weight of the responsibility of what we do as policymakers is always important. And perhaps a little bit more passionate about this, again, because of the generational question. Because I have a dad who receives invalidity pension, but no pension because he was not eligible. And I understand the vulnerability of that. I'm a little bit more passionate because as Minister of Culture, with a sector in which we have lots of people who are themselves vulnerable. And I made that comment to say that it is important for our cultural artists as well to realize that situations change, that they too will become vulnerable, and they too can end up in a situation in which they have nothing. And that the decision, therefore, that we take to act is a personal one. It has a personal impact. This is not a nameless piece of legislation. of reform measures, Mr. President, is personal because it impacts livelihoods for generations. And therefore, Mr. President, as I close, again, I ask the Honourable Chamber, I say to the Honourable Chamber, we must do the right thing. I thank you, Mr. President. I'm obliged.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Senator Crystal Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon to the Chamber, and also good afternoon to our guests and the young ones behind me, a special good afternoon. I will not keep you too long from your lunch, but sometimes this is the course we have to take when we are debating such matters of public importance, which today we definitely are. Mr. President, the leader of government business said something that stuck with me, and it is something I want to reiterate. Whenever you talk about pensions, it is inherently divisive. It truly is. And at the end of the day, nobody wants to carry the burden, whether it's the ones who are already receiving a pension or the ones who are of working age who have to contribute to the pot of funds that is going towards pension benefits or benefits, Social Security benefits in general. But sir, one of the things that I want to start by saying is that, first of all, pensions in general are a very modern construct. Prior to the industrial age, there was no such thing as a pension. It evolved out of the industrial era that was said earlier, that you had this large group of persons who came out of the war. You had persons now who, because the base of the economy had changed from agricultural to manufacturing, and you had to find some way of providing some type of protection for them. And Mr. President, it was not until in the 1930s that the US instituted universal coverage for its workers under an act called the Sterling-LeBob Act. And that was in 1920, sorry, Mr. President. That covered 300 federal employees under their Social Security scheme. So when we have this debate, it is also in the context of the times that we're also living in. We are now moving into what we call a postmodern era. We're coming out of heavy manufacturing into services, and what does that mean for the labor force and the movement of persons in and out of the labor force, and the contracts that determine, what our service is and how do you enter into a contract of service and the like, Mr. President. But as was stated earlier, our scheme clearly then started in 1967 under a very different demographic context, and also economic as well, Mr. President. And what we heard just now in the honourable members, the former contribution that Senator Monroe Knight stated, is this constant evolution that has been occurring as it relates to our national insurance scheme. And Mr. President, the debate that we are having today, I think we have to start from the premise that we have to do something right now to mitigate problems in the future based on the design of the fund, Mr. President. And I want to make my contribution based on looking at the problem that we face in two ways. It was mentioned earlier in the former contributions, but I want to drill down into one certain design of the fund. That is the technical parameters that make up how the fund works. Sir, and then also looking at the governance of the national insurance scheme and how it relates to credibility issues. How it relates to credibility issues, Mr. President. Mr. President, first, the design of the fund. The 17th actuarial report has stated that the fund is at risk because there is a widening of the gap between the fund's income, and we heard this earlier, the fund's income, contributions, and investment income, and expenditure, total expenditure, all the benefits that are paid out of the fund. So whatever measures that we have to take now, Mr. President, the aim is to close the gap between contribution income and the benefit expenditure. That is the sole aim, the premise by which we have to take measures to mitigate any future collapse of the fund. And sir, we have to take those measures in the context that it is not just something that we do now, momentarily, but it has to be continuous, Mr. President. But what is driving that gap? And I'm sorry that Senator Monroe and I did not go into more detail, but I will try to do so, Mr. President. What is driving this gap? And she spoke about the gap in relation to the 90s, but I will move forward from 2016. Mr. President, in 2002, since 2002, the benefits expenditure of the fund have moved from 285 million to 870 million in 2021. That is a compound annual growth rate of 6.4% in benefits expenditure. Remember, benefits expenditure is the money that is being paid out. The money that is being paid out, 93% of the money being paid out is to pensions. So you have benefit expenditures increasing from 2002 to 2021 by 6.4%, and 93% of that, you can call it almost all of it, is to old age contributory pension. Mr. President, and why is that happening? As we move deeper into why these things are occurring, why is that happening? Sir, there's an increase in the population claiming retirement benefits, longer life expectancy among retired population. And we heard last week, which was a statistic that even startled me when I heard it, 52% of persons who retired in 2000, 23 years ago, are still receiving a pension today. So there is a combination of things that are happening with the fund and around the design of the fund that is warranting a change in its design. Mr. President, it was also mentioned that we have the highest minimum pension. That is something that needs to be reiterated. But on top of having the highest minimum pension, we also have the highest contribution rate. We pay for it, Mr. President. We pay for that high minimum pension. But on the other side of the calculation, Mr. President, which is the income coming in, the money that the fund earns has only increased in the same time period by 3.94%. So that is much lower than the 6.4. So any way you slice it, Mr. President, you have a problem. You have a problem that needs to be addressed if the fund is to be sustainable in the future. Sir, and why are these ratios having this discrepancy? We drill down even further. Sir, Barbados in 2004 had approximately 119,000 contributors to the fund. On average, it was about 3.6 contributors to pensioners. You don't have 3.6 of a person, so let's round that off to 4, Mr. President. So 4 people contributing, 1 person receiving a pension. By 2021, Mr. President, we have now 105,000 persons contributing to the fund. But the ratio between contributors and pensioners has also decreased. We went from 3.6 now to 2.2. So well, you got round down now because the number is below 5. That's how I was taught math. 2 contributors to 1 pensioner. And sir, development planning has sometimes unintended consequences. The leader of government business framed her comments in relation to the amount of money that is placed in education. That's all right. In education, Mr. President, when you educate a population, there's a general trend that people, and women in particular, who, when you have higher rates of education among women, they have fewer children. That's a general trend. We also, in addition to that, in the 80s and the 90s, had a strong family planning program, Mr. President. So these are the secondary effects that those policies have, and why we have now to come to evolve what is happening with the National Insurance Scheme because of policies that were implemented 20, 30 years ago, Mr. President. Sir, I also want to state that in addition to the number of persons who are contributing and who are pensioners to the fund, 40% of new cases to the National Insurance Scheme are bumped up to minimum pension. 40%. So we have a generous minimum pension, which when persons apply and they don't qualify, they get bumped up. And 40% of active pensioners are also receiving that minimum pension. So we see, Mr. President, there is a ballooning of those benefit expenditures through our pension scheme, Mr. President. Sir, I know a lot of people also frame comments about the fund in relation to, and this is something that I take very personal, make comments about the fund in relation to the non-contributory pensioners. Non-contributory pension is not paid out of NIS funds. It is paid from the consolidated fund through government. On average, this is about $8 million. In 2021, it's about $8 million, Mr. President. And for the life of me, Mr. President, growing up in a society where there are persons who were on sugar plantations, fishermen, people who were barely literate, Mr. President, who send school people like my parents, you then look at them because they did not have the foresight to put down for their retirement because they did not come from an age where they had to do that. They worked till they died, Mr. President. To say to a reform committee or have the opinion that stop having non-contributory pension in Barbados, what society are we living in, Mr. President? Where is the social justice? Where do we say thank you to those persons in our society? They don't affect the pension that is contributory. It is in no way affecting it. So I do not understand, Mr. President, I said it's a bit personal for me. I do not understand the notion that you have some of the most vulnerable persons in your society and you're saying to them the little bit that they are getting, they should not receive it. Because that's the housewives. Those are the types of persons receiving non-contributory pensions, Mr. President. Not CEOs. But Mr. President, I move on. I just wanted to make that point. Mr. President, we heard that this is also not unique to Barbados, and this is true. By 2050, it is expected that Nigeria will become the third largest populated country in the world, outstripping the US by 2050, Mr. President. And there is an ongoing debate about how those demographics in developed countries are changing and what it means for economic powerhouses, what it means for geopolitical tensions and constructs, Mr. President. And what we are seeing is almost a change of the guard, because a lot of the emerging economies are those with populations that are growing, which are not those that are, of the Northern Hemisphere, Mr. President. They're found in Africa, they're found in Asia. And that then also has implications, Mr. President, for what happens globally and to the global economy, Mr. President. So this is not a conversation that is unique to Barbados, and that is something I think that needs to also be said again, Mr. President, because when we look at how we are building out our social policy, which this is squarely of the bedrock of our social policy, we have to be cognizant that we are living in a world that is extremely dynamic, and in another 10 to 15, 20 years, when we look outside, it will look completely different. Who's calling the shots, Mr. President? Mr. President, since, and this is going back now to the design of the fund, since 2016, for the last 7 years or so, the contribution income fell short of total expenditure. The contribution income fell short of total expenditure every single year since 2016. It's taken out a lot more than is being put in. Sir, the last shortfall we had was that of, in 2021, was $269 million. I can say that again. Contribution income fell short of total expenditure in 2021 by $269 million. So, how does the NAS deal with this, Mr. President? It dips in and liquidates its assets. That's how it makes up the shortfall, by investment income, Mr. President. And this is another dynamic of the fund that persons have to understand. Has to understand, Mr. President, 80%, and I'm looking directly now at the director so that I make sure that I have my numbers right. Through you, Mr. President, looking at her through you. 80% of the portfolio is located in the local market. 67% is in government paper. The fund has about $4 billion in assets, unaudited. I'll put that as a caveat, because I know that that would also be a point of contention. But, Mr. President, even unaudited, you can see that there is a high exposure to the fund to what happens in the local economy. And any fund manager will tell you this portfolio's exposure to the local market is too high. You have to diversify your portfolio, Mr. President. And I was quite happy to hear and to be informed last week in the briefing that we had, and subsequently in the media, that we are now allocating US $40 million, or the fund has been allocated US $40 million in foreign exchange to diversify its portfolio outside of the Barbados market. And I believe one of the first securities that's being taken up is US Treasury bills, Mr. President. So, sir, because of the demographic change, the fund has to complement contribution income with a diversified portfolio in investments to complement and supplement the contribution income to pay out the benefits that when people go in the line and stand up to wait for the pension, they can get it. That is the cold, hard facts. We cannot get away from it, Mr. President. So, if we are having a conversation that we do not want the age to increase, we do not want the contribution rate to increase, and at the same time, we want to retain all of the benefits. And these are things that were discussed in the core group, Mr. President. I don't know how much liberty I have, but I'll keep it vague enough that I don't divulge too much. But in the core group, we had brainstorming sessions about one, yes, the design in its current form. You keep the minimum pension, you keep all of the benefits. How do you change and tweak the parameters to extend the life of the fund? But on the other hand, we also we spoke about the design, the structure. Do you remove a minimum pension? Do you have a lower pension that's a universal pension? And then you have the NIS pension on top of that? But those all required major reforms. So if the reforms that we have now are causing all of this debate, I could not even imagine, Mr. President, if the fund went about having a structural change in how it operates, Mr. President. But be rest assured that being part of that core group, Mr. President, all ideas contended. It was then left up to the administration and the board to make their decisions on what they believed were the best recommendations at the time. But it is not a case that we did not consider keeping the age at 67. But when you took into account the modeling and what were the material parameters that extended the life of the fund, age was one of the most sensitive parameters that gave you the material change that you wanted to extend the life of the fund. And therefore, one of the recommendations, ever so slightly, in my opinion, was to increase the age over a very long, if we're being honest, it's a very long time period. It truly is. So I understand, Mr. President, that a lot of the measures that were highlighted in the ministerial statement made in the other place will cause inherent divisiveness. I understand it. And personally, I have two parents, Mr. President, who are on the verge of retiring. So I'm not standing up here because this ain't going to affect me in X amount of years, so I don't have to care. I got two parents on the verge of retiring. So I understand what this means, Mr. President. But let us also take into account when we are challenging the changes that are being proposed, to know that on the back end, there is still a fund to maintain. And coming out of the stakeholder consultations, the vast majority of persons said, we need to keep the fund. We need to keep the National Insurance Fund. So if that is the overarching goal, Mr. President, something's got to give. Something has got to give. But Mr. President, I turn now, remember I said 2 points, Mr. President, I hope you give me a little leeway today. 2 points, two lens by which, two lens by which I wanted to have this debate on. The first was the design of the fund, and I walked through some of the demographic challenges that we're facing. But Mr. President, the governance of the fund. Sir, I am speaking solely on my own behalf here. When I say for the sake of the fund, and I've said it in other fora, for the sake of the fund, Mr. President, this administration, in some regard, has to acquiesce to public sentiment. And I'll tell you why I say that. Sir, there is a belief, perception, real or otherwise, Mr. President, that the National Insurance Fund is in trouble because of poor management, irrespective of administration throughout the years. Real or otherwise, that is the perception. And sometimes perception is greater than reality, Mr. President. Sir, when you take into account issues that have been in the public domain, like outstanding audited financial statements since 2015, I don't know if we've made any progress in that regard, but since 2015, we haven't had audited financial statements, and that is required by law. Sir, the 2019 debt restructuring affecting $1.3 billion of the fund's assets. The debacle of the Clearwater investment for the Four Seasons project, $124 million, Mr. President. Sir, and then on top of that, poor compliance by employers who seemingly get away with it without recourse. Those, Mr. President, are the issues
Mr. President, I rise on a point of order.
Yes, Senator Cummings?
I believe that the Honourable Senator, although well-meaning, may be misleading the Honourable Chamber. The amount invested in Four Seasons is actually not that amount, but I believe the total exposure to the NIS in Four Seasons is $9 million. I'm being corrected, actually, that it is $8 million, and the intention is also that that is meant to be repaid and is not to be. It's already been repaid, I'm being told.
Proceed, Senator Drakes.
I take that clarification, and that is the number that I drew from the Auditor General's report of 2020, I believe it was, but I stand corrected. But that was the source of my information about the $124 million, Mr. President. I'm going to ignore the asides because I know where the territory that I'm going in, the asides will come, Mr. President. But Mr. President, nonetheless, those are the issues that dominate the public's perception about the fund. And Mr. President, that then goes to the heart of the issue of credibility. We are asking persons who are now working, Mr. President, and telling them that NAS is more than a contribution, it is their lifeline, Mr. President. You have to institute measures, Mr. President, that send a strong signal that we are going to be courageous, as was said earlier, in relation to the governance of the National Insurance Scheme. Sir, if the measures before us are to be taken as is, and now I want to speak directly to the National Insurance and Social Security Amendment Bill 2023. Sir, we're changing the National Insurance Scheme over to a commercial state-owned enterprise. the leader of government business went through her contribution in explaining how that is being done and why that is being done. And I take that point, Mr. President. But what I have a concern about, as far as it relates to engendering trust and allowing persons in the public to feel as though we are seriously taking on their concerns, Mr. President, about the credibility and how the fund is being run, Mr. President, I have to, Mr. President, raise Clause 11Y. Clause 11Y of the bill, the National Insurance and Social Security Amendment Bill, says the minister may give directions. Sir, allow me to read the clause. It says the minister may give general directions to the board with respect to the performance of its functions, powers, and duties under this act or any other enactment, and the board shall act in accordance with those directions. The clause has a part 2 that says, subject to this section, the board shall not be subject to the control or direction of any other person or service, Mr. President. Mr. President, when you read legislation and you know the importance of the word may and shall, 11Y then becomes very important in the measures that we are putting together to ensure that the governance of the fund is viewed as credible, Mr. President. Because I will ask this question: what happens when the board is given directions that they deem disadvantageous to the fund and its shareholders? And where is the legal protection and process for the board to decline the minister's directive, Mr. President? I'm hearing you resign from the board. But that does not engender transparency. And that is what we want, especially with a matter as sensitive as the national insurance. Because if the board, in some eventuality or some situation, Mr. President, does not want to take on the directives of the minister.
Mr. President, I really regret. I rise on a point of order, Mr. President, and I regret having to do so, but I would not want that to go into the domain. A minister giving directions of a general nature is in fact quite standard across many of these boards. However, the distinction, and I know this myself personally because in another incarnation, Honourable Mr. President, I happen to be the minister with responsibility, for example, the Fair Trading Commission. I cannot give directions of a specific nature. I cannot influence the work or the decision-making of the various bodies as the minister. And the use of the word, I understand, may, as opposed to shall, but what is most important in this clause, Mr. President, is general directions as opposed to specific directions. And I certainly have seen, and I'm being reminded that we've had many instances where boards have chosen to decline those general directions, certainly if they are specific enough to cause problems.
Yeah,
Continue, Senator
but,
Ricks.
Mr. President, thank you. And maybe that vagueness lends even to more ambiguity because what are general directions? I don't know, Mr. President. I'm just saying. What the point I'm trying to make, Mr. President, the point that I am trying to make, Mr. President, is that because of the sensitive nature of the fund, and all that it has been through in the last few years, Mr. President, and now having to ask persons to shoulder the burden, to work longer, pay more contributions, Mr. President. All I'm saying is to ring fence in some way, give legal protection to the board. That's all I'm saying, Mr. President. Because at the moment, there are no explicit safeguards. There are no explicit safeguards in law for the board, Mr. President. And in my opinion, Mr. President, I believe it is a missed opportunity to add another layer of protection to give the board the level of autonomy that it needs, and in the event that there is some divergence of views, there is the legal protection and due process for the board, Mr. President. But, sir, I will start to wrap up my contribution by saying a few comments. These reforms started with the process of stakeholder engagement. That was a step in the right direction, of course, Mr. President. You're affecting people's lives, and therefore they should have a say. But, Mr. President, I believe that in addition to speaking specifically about the national insurance and specifically old age contributionary pension, we should have also had the opportunity along the way to speak about more holistic reforms. Because, Mr. President, when you have a situation where, excuse me, Mr. President, when you have a situation where contributing to private pensions is somewhat seen as being penalized because you no longer get the tax allowance, that is a point of discussion and something that should have been brought to the table as well. At the moment, if you contribute to a private pension plan, there's no incentive to continue to do so on behalf of the government, Mr. President. If we are saying to persons, plan for your retirement and make the necessary steps and adjustments in your financial planning, I do believe that some tax allowance should be reinstated to encourage that participation, Mr. President. Sir, in addition to that, if we are being fulsome in the debate, the taxing of pensions. You work, Mr. President, you are taxed. You put aside your money for your old age pension, private or otherwise, and you are taxed. Double taxation, Mr. President. And I don't know the numbers, but I would really like to know how much revenue the government really gets from the taxation of pensions. Because if it is immaterial, Mr. President, it is a measure that can be scrapped. It is a measure that can be scrapped. And, Mr. President, going even further, and this would be my final point, we are talking about social policy, and we're talking about the general contract that a government has with its citizens. And, Mr. President, the leader of government business, I believe it was, said, we have to look at these measures in the context of, are they reasonable? I believe her words were, and are they logical? That's the next word. Logical and reasonable. But, Mr. President, I'll ask another question. Are they just? Mr. President, we have a situation right now where the measures that are coming down the pipeline are not seen as just in relation to the pension arrangement of elected members of Parliament. At present, we have armed forces who retire at the age, the BDF, Barbados Defence Force, and so on, who retire at 55. I stand corrected, but I believe it is 55. People risking life and limb. Is there a point in the discussion, Mr. President, where the government, while instituting measures for others, also gives a little and looks at the pensionable age of elected members of parliament to say, many hands make light work, Mr. President, and we are all in this together. Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Crystal Drakes. Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon. I got here a little bit late, so kind of like the pensions miscellaneous bill. But I wasn't quite sure, Mr. President, if we were addressing these two bills together as a cognate debate, because all of the discussion so far has focused on the national insurance scheme, understandably in some ways, and I will focus on that to some extent, though not exclusively, because I think it is important for us to discuss the two bills in front of us that will affect substantially to discuss the two bills that will affect people who live in Barbados. So in my preparation, I was inspired a little bit reflective, because this is the season of emancipation. Season of emancipation, what does that mean? Well, obviously we are free. And we attain this freedom through struggle of many persons, as Senator Drake made very clear. So there was a lot of struggle. 1834, granting of emancipation on August 1st, really being actualized in 1838. We had rebellions, what we would call the Busser Rebellion in 1816. There were acts of subversion by those enslaved before then. There were many acts of defiance of injustice in Barbados. And out of this, in this same season of emancipation, a few Wednesdays ago, we were in here on the Day of National Significance, when we perhaps should have reflected on exactly that. That the poor and underprivileged rose in rebellion against intolerable living conditions. Those were the words of the late Tom Adams, given on July 26, 1977, in the other place, when that day became the Day of National Significance. And I raise all of this because I see a focus on things like the national insurance scheme, or service as it may become, as a continuation of this. Because all of this struggle was really about ensuring that we get from a place of human indignity in Barbados to a place where people can live in dignity. Emancipation, freedom, all of this is about the human condition. And one of the things that the National Insurance Scheme is supposed to do is to provide some protections against these indignities in our society. So we should all celebrate this season of emancipation, Black, white, Indian, Chinese, whatever we are, because freedom is for all of us, and unfreedoms and injustices for some really are injustices for humanity. So how are we getting to the national insurance? When we look at the progression of the institutions that we have in this country, the policies and the legislation that we have in this country and that we have developed in this country, certainly since independence, but even beginning before then, a lot of them have to do with exactly this. We can recognize that this is a social democratic state, and instead of being rightist in our democracy, ultra-liberal, we have put in place mechanisms such as the NAS to ensure or to strive towards people living in human dignity. Things like the non-contributory pension, which Senator Drakes rightly informed us and reminded us come from the Consolidated Fund, again, are about human dignity. So in all of our discussions about actuarial reviews and projections that are run and all kinds of things, I think it is important for us to keep this squarely in our minds, that we are really thinking about human dignity. So the pensionable age, which is not addressed in this legislation, and if it is going to be changed, it cannot be changed by this legislation. So I expect that we will come back again to amend once again, which I have questions about. Why not just do all of this one time? However, the pensionable age, this too is about human dignity. This is not just a numerical calculation, you know. 67, what's the difference between 67 and 68? That's one year. 1 year may mean a lot in terms of someone's ability to live in dignity and to work in a dignified way. But I suppose that is just a thought, and we understand some of the difficulties that those addressing the fund may have had to deal with. All of this said, the maintenance and sustenance of the NAS. These things are important, and we have to treat them in that way. We really do need to treat them with a level of seriousness that they require, and not just as technical matters. The policy and legislation surrounding certainly the contents of the fund, investment, etc. is important. All of these things are important. We know that national insurance, Social Security as it stands in Barbados, protects us throughout our adult life, can protect us throughout our adult life. We talk about having a larger population in Barbados, maternity and paternity leave and benefits will be necessary for that. People will get sick, so you need that. People will lose their job at some point. They may lose their job. They may fall upon some injury that causes them to be disabled, unable to work. I hate the term that's in the current legislation, invalidity benefit. I hope that one day when further amendments are made to this legislation that we change that term invalidity to something a little more progressive sounding. When you call people an invalid, that's a really outmoded kind of term. As I said, unemployment, and of course, as we are dealing with today, retirement and pension. So we're looking at the whole working life of people. And this allows, the reason that the NIS can allow for dignity is that this is not some place that you have to go and beg, like welfare, where people might feel a little like, oh, I don't want to go to the welfare department and beg, because you are contributing. And because you are contributing, you know that certain things are due to you. You are not begging anyone for anything. And this is a much more dignified way, in my estimation, to approach the affairs of the people in Barbados. So, as I said, amending this legislation is a matter of seriousness. It requires skill, consultation, as we've heard occurred, and also appropriate and effective communication. And this is the thing that has befuddled me in all of this. If I just stayed at home and I listened, or I read my newspaper, I would have no idea that this legislation does not address the pensionable age. If I just stayed at home and I read my paper or newspapers, I listened to the radio, I watched the news, I would have no idea that there's nothing in this legislation that changes the number of weeks that one has to work in order to receive a pension from 500 to 750. I would have no clue. I would here be telling myself, as I've heard other people say, that under the cover of darkness, in the season of emancipation, crop over, they are looking to increase the pensionable age, rush it through Parliament without telling us anything. Yes, they had the consultations, but they did not get back to us. Why do people think this? Is it because they're being mischievous? Some people are being mischievous, to be sure. But I do not think the majority of people are. Because we are standing, and putting everything in the pot one time, and then expecting the public to be sufficiently discerning to recognize that this legislation is not today, Wednesday, the 9th of August, if it is passed, going to increase the pensionable age. And that today, this legislation, nothing that I see in the legislation at least, is addressing the number of weeks persons have to work. And this is why it says a little untidy for other reasons too, because we know now that these are things that are proposed and are quite likely to occur. We are amending this legislation today, or we're trying to amend it today. So, Why not bring everything one time? We have the revitalization report. We had a presentation scheduled, as Senator Cummings rightly told us last week. We had personnel who are going around informing people. So why are we amending this legislation today, knowing the things that we intend to do in the future, and not including this in the amendment? As it is, as it stands. And I said regular people, right? And I said regular, no, this is in the bill because well, I'm so glad that something just prompted me to remember this. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a little spirit that moved me or something. But in the second schedule of the principal legislation, the second schedule lays out the pensionable ages. That is not a regulation. That is the second schedule that forms part of the legislation. It was enacted, right? The second schedule, you can go and look, the second schedule, which will now become the first schedule in this amendment, lays out the pensionable age. It lays out what previous pensionable ages were, and it shows the progression to what we have right now, which is age 67. So if there is any intention to move this age from 67 to 67 and a half and then 68, that schedule needs to be addressed. That cannot be addressed by some magical regulation change or anything of the sort. The number of weeks perhaps can be addressed by the regulations. But this is in the schedule that came to Parliament, both houses, and was legislated. So this is what I'm saying about communication. And it's not, as I said, for regular people who are home, just listening. And a lot of people are not going to sit down and listen to all of this, hours of this. They're going to hear the little snippet that's coming over on the news, the little piece that is covered in the paper. If they hear the calling program, they will know that this is not in the legislation because somebody in the calling program said so. They might be in here, probably are, right? But the point is that for things as important as the NAS, that people will get hot and bothered and flustered about, and we'll talk about staying home on a Wednesday and marching because this is being sneaked in during crop over. We have to communicate more effectively and let people know this is a plan for the future. This is not something we are doing this week. This is a plan for the future. Because if you don't tell them it's a plan for the future, they get a lot of suspicion. This is something that they're easing in this week. And we didn't even get a chance to sit down and digest it properly. People need a little chance to be miserable about things, you know. You do. You get a new change, you need a little time, and you can say, man, this bare foolishness, but you know what? I can't figure out what else I could do. You can't just push it on people Friday and expect them to take it Wednesday. These are things that exactly while they got jumping up and, you know, drinks and whatever else happens, all the festivities and revelry and merriment, CARICOM Day and everything else. Anyway, I know people laughed at that, but it was being serious and true. You have to really give people a little time to mull over things. So the clarity is important. And something that has been very frustrating to me, is that the actual content of this amendment, I don't think anybody has a clue about it. This amendment is really dealing with governance. This amendment is dealing with the governance of the NAS, which is important. And it is important because we don't want to continue ending up in situations where people say, somebody carrying money from the NAS and they can't get my pension. We don't want to end up in situations where people are asking about the audited financial reports. We don't want to end up in situations where people are asking about how the money is invested and did we follow the appropriate rules as laid out. These are things that are critical so that whenever changes are made, people may feel a sense of comfort that in 2038, they're not going to have to go through this again. Or that in 2040, when some people who are in here will still be working and didn't reach the pensionable age yet, the age will increase again to 70-something. So these are really important things to communicate to the public, you know, because there is a belief that the NIS is not properly managed, is not properly administered, that it is, you hear it all the time, it is the government's piggy bank. And if it is that the intention of this amendment is to shore up the operations of the national insurance by changing the name to service, by specifying very clearly what the board is supposed to do, what different officers are supposed to do. These types of officers that are being put in place, including to deal with risk, the different committees that are established, these are things that should be in the front of the minds of the public. These are the things that they should know and should understand. And I find it slightly irritating that the way that this amendment has been communicated, the way that this amendment has been presented is in a way that has led to confusion, that has led to people feeling upset and hurt, rather than understanding that that is not what this is about. It is important to inform people of what is going to happen in the future, but you have to do it in a way that is clear. Otherwise, this kind of suspicion continues to linger. And then there will be complaints from various places about fake news and mischief and all kind of thing. Mr. President, that is what I really have to say on the NIS legislation. In front of me, there are people who have come to me and asked me, you gonna have our backs on this? You gonna let them raise this thing to 67 on Wednesday? To 68, sorry, on Wednesday? And I have to say to them, but that's not what we're doing on Wednesday. At least not my understanding. And they're asking me, what were you talking about? I read the paper, I listen to the news. That is what they're doing on Wednesday. You gonna go in there and vote for that on Wednesday? And I'm not voting for it on Wednesday because that is not, in my opinion, what is before me. As far as I could tell, my reading, my comprehension, my everything says that that is not before me right now. So if it is that I sit down and I vote for this legislation, it is not because any age is changing. It is because I think that it is really important to have a properly structured and well-governed national insurance and social security system in operation. And I think that there are useful steps in this legislation that will take us in that direction. I don't know if they're perfect, but I think it is an effort, and is an effort that is meaningful and should be given a chance to work before, we assess it one way or another. And that is what I am dealing with today. I'm not dealing with the age. That is something for another time. I hope it is for another time. I would have preferred if it were for today too, but it is not, in my opinion, for today. There are some that have asked me if it is, I am saying that this is not in the legislation. Why was this presented in a way that could lead to that confusion? Is it a kite flying exercise? You're flying a kite to see if people, how they're going to respond to the 68 and the 750 weeks? I don't know. I cannot answer that question. All I can say to these people is, what I read is that it is not addressing that, it is addressing governance. It is talking about a number of officers, it is talking about the role of the board, how the board will be selected, the powers to borrow, to invest, procedures for all of this, and I think that these are things that we should have. Better structure, better governance. Not just in the NIS, but really in many areas, public and private sector, I would say, and civil society too, some organizations. But we don't need to go there. That's the general point. The next one, public sector pensions. And obviously this is very important. Now, in this legislation before us, get the name correct, the Pensions Miscellaneous Provisions Bill. This touches, I tried to count them. It touches, 4 pieces of legislation and 2 sets of regulations. Public Employees Pension Regulation 1961, National Insurance and Social Security Act which is what we're addressing today. The teachers, secondary school pensions regulations, 1962. So it's 3 regulations. Pensions regulations, 1947. Statutory Board Pensions Act, Cap 38. Public Employees Pension Act, Cap 30. Pensions Act, Cap 25. It touches a lot of things, a lot of areas. So I think it is important that people understand. Now, the persons who are already within the public sector or working in state-owned enterprises, they might feel all right about this because this bill, what it really does is it affects persons who will be joining various areas in the public service and so on from the 1st of January 2024. So people already working in there might tell themselves, all right, it's not really affecting me. But we talk about things that we talk about young people, and perhaps not so young people as well, who may be changing their jobs and so on. And I think it is important for them to have an understanding that if you are going to take up a job from 2024 as a teacher in a public secondary school, for instance, or in some other area in the public sector, or in some state-owned enterprise, the way that your pensions will function will not be the same as how your parent or your friend or your neighbor or whoever that has previously been working there, how their pension has functioned. You're going to have to make some contributions, and you're going to have to make contributions at particular rates. It is important for people to know these things. And again, I don't think there has been sufficient emphasis on this. The public sector is really important. We know it requires some reform. We hear about reform all of the time. And this is one step towards that. It is one step towards this. These public sector pensions, reforming public sector pensions, are so important that even in the International Monetary Fund Extended Fund Facility program that Barbados entered, the government of Barbados indicated that this is something important that must be reformed. It must be reformed. And it set targets. This is a benchmark. The IMF money that people are talking about, reforming pension law is one of the benchmarks. And it has been one of the benchmarks. One that we've missed, by the way. In March 2022, it was extended to March 2022 because of COVID. And then I see extended to March 2023 because of something that it was supposed to come to the Houses of Parliament to be addressed. But better late than never. The point is, so important was this, so significant a structural reform to the economy of Barbados, to the viability and the fiscal sustainability, the IMF reports, the Article 4 consultations notes. This is so important to that it comes up 31 times in the 2021 document. 31. 2022 document, 37 times. And it's not just the number of times it comes up, it is the manner in which it features. Because it talks about the sustainability, the fiscal sustainability of the country. In part, not in whole. It also deals with things like SOE reform and other measures, taxation, a variety of things. But pensions feature in there, public sector pensions. And there's so little discussion of this. This is one of the benchmarks. Now, not meeting this benchmark does not mean that we will be denied funding or anything of the sort, but it is one of the ways by which the IMF measures how we are doing with the program that was homegrown, that we set up, and we said that this is what we plan to do. We have a letter of intent signed by the Prime Minister that indicates that we plan to do this pension reform to ensure fiscal stability of Barbados. So there are two things that are happening here when we talk about human dignity. We need a country that is stable so that people can operate in it with human dignity. But we also want to ensure that those who are working in the public sector, they have a pension. In addition to the NAS pension that is $1,000 and something that is supposedly generous. They need a pension in addition to that. So there's a balance that is being found between the fiscal stability, I am assuming, there's a balance that is being found between the fiscal stability and sustainability that is required, this helps us move towards, and also having people provide for themselves when they are seniors, ensuring that they do not just have to rely on that NIS pension, as important as it is, there's something to supplement. These are important things. I don't want to go into too much detail about what the IMF documents say and what the government of Barbados has said about how significant this is. Oh, you want details? All right. I'll have to read a little bit though. You'll have to excuse me. Air conditioning really affects my sinuses. All right. So in 2021, as I said, 31 mentions of this. And I tried to make note of them and to note the context, but it is quite a lot. So within the structural benchmarks related to tabling, some of these relate to tabling a revised public pension law. This was reset, as I said, to March 2022, listed in the structural benchmarks that were supposed to have, this was supposed to have been implemented in December 2021 and was extended to March 2022. The Article 4 consultation of November 2021 indicates in its evaluation of Barbados' performance while under the facility that the authorities in Barbados plan to reform the pension system and introduce a fiscal rule which will also support fiscal sustainability. And to be honest, the 2022 document says much of the same. In seeking funding from the IMF under a 36-month extended fund facility, we have objectives and modalities which include pension reform. Public pension reform is key to this, and the Prime Minister, Honourable Prime Minister, is cited as having indicated such, and that this is important for fiscal sustainability. This is in November, dated the 9th of November 2022. Maintaining and strengthening the macroeconomic stability of Barbados. In order to maintain and strengthen macroeconomic stability in Barbados, public pension reform is key. So this is something that's critical. I really don't want to belabor this point too much, but public pension reform is critical and people need to understand it. Those young people, as I said, not so young or whatever age, are entering the public service from the 1st of January 2024, need to understand that your pension is going to be different because it is part of the structural reform for the economy of Barbados. How is it going to be different? I have written it down. We have, first of all, there is going to be a public service pension fund that is going to be managed and housed within the same NIS that we were just speaking about. And there will be deductions at the rate of 5% for persons who exceed the maximum pensionable emoluments and 2% for those who do not exceed it, so earning at a lesser rate. And then there's also the ability to top up. So you can put in a voluntary contribution, 3% for the upper band and 1% for those at the lower level. So these are important. We talk about education, educating people as to their business. I think this is important. And as I said, those who are already in the public sector may not need to be so educated about it, but those looking to enter, they should know. If you're leaving university, if you're leaving school, if you're leaving SJPI, BCC, if you're leaving one job and going to another, that these are the terms. So, Mr. President, in addressing these two pieces of legislation, I want to say that I don't think there's anything pernicious in either. I don't think there's anything that is afoot from what I can tell. Has the content of this legislation been appropriately communicated to the public of Barbados? I would say no, because the communication has led to so much that has upset and bothered people that I wonder why. Why are we proceeding with people's business in this way? But to me, they're, as I said before, useful and relevant things for us to consider and to note in this legislation. And I thank you for this opportunity to speak, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of this sitting of the Senate for 1 hour for a lunch break to resume at 3:20 in the PM. I'm sorry, 3:10 PM.
The question is that the Honourable Senate be suspended until 3:10 p.m. today. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it very enthusiastically as well. This sit is now suspended until 3:10 p.m. today.
Mr. President,